I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as President Zelensky appears to reject Donald Trump's proposal for Ukraine to cede territory to Moscow, we examine the new European plan set to be presented to the US later on. We also report on Ukrainian troops still holding out in the frontline city of Pokrovsk before turning to developments inside Russia, including Putin's new law requiring 100,000 military reservists to undergo 2 months of training and growing protests over tax rises.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in 1 day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 9th of December, 3 years and 290 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Nicholls, and the podcast's very own Russia analyst, James Kilner. But first, the latest from the front lines.
Right, Pokrovsk has not yet fallen, despite Putin's recent claim that Russian forces have taken the city. Those words come from our friend and colleague Jonathan Beale, the defence editor of the BBC. He's reporting from the east of Ukraine at the moment. He says there is no doubt Ukraine has been losing ground in the city. The city is in ruins, he says. The battle there has been grinding on for nearly 18 months. But he says Russian forces have slowly been advancing from the south. Ukraine is losing ground, but says it still holds the north up to the railway line that bisects the city. He was with a number of Ukrainian forces in the headquarters where they had personnel on the ground that went into the city to raise the Ukrainian flag and take a photo. We see this quite a lot. Doesn't mean they hold that position, just that they are there for that brief moment in time. Anyway, he said that he reports the Russians have been using small teams of 2 to 4 soldiers to get past Ukrainian positions, sometimes dressed as civilians. One Ukrainian battalion commander said that's a good tactic to get behind enemy lines, to get a foothold, but then added the enemy who gets into our rear is quickly identified and destroyed. One soldier, known to Johnny Beale as Rabbit, described the situation as hard but under control. He showed Johnny a Russian machine gun captured by one of his comrades who spent 70 straight days fighting in Pokrovsk. Rabbit said all he wanted was cigarettes and ammunition. Now, the fighting is clearly taking its toll on Ukrainian forces, Johnny says, but there's no sign of them giving up. Nor does Rabbit agree with any suggestion that Ukraine should give up more land for peace. He says too much blood has already been spilt. He said, we are part of this land. If we give it up, Russia will want more. Another soldier, call sign Ghost, fighting in another unit in Pokrovsk, describes the situation as tense but not critical. He dismissed reports of the city's capture as a Russian propaganda, saying reports that Pokrovsk is surrounded is fake information. However, he added that everyone is exhausted, both Russia and Ukraine. Now, Johnny reports the Russians have been using drones with thermal imaging cameras, or more of them than Ukraine has. Obviously, they'll be able to see at night. One soldier said that he and his men always hope for good weather, by which he meant fog, rain and grey sky. Johnny finishes by saying the message from the troops we talked to is that the situation in Pokrovsk is not so bleak, but Ukraine needs proof of its resolve at this critical time. We'll put a link in the episode notes to Johnny's article. Otherwise, elsewhere around the country, no significant other move. Still no great move by Russia west in the area of Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia Oblast border areas. Similarly, no further move in Kupiansk up in the northeast. Reports recently that Ukraine had counterattacked in that area. That seems to have held the situation, although they've not been able to eject Russian forces completely from the city, but nor has Russia been able to get through. Sumy left without power this morning following Russian attacks last night. 24 of 110 Russian drones got through air defence, hitting 9 locations. They were mainly in the north, in Sumy, just as I said, then rotating east through Kharkiv, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson in the south, where 2 people were killed there. In total, 10 people killed in the last 24 hours, 43 others injured, according to local authorities. Now, you remember that strike on Ternopil in the west of Ukraine on November the 19th. 2 ballistic missiles hit a residential block there, killed dozens of civilians. Well, as of today, the death toll stands at 38 after police say they identified the bodies of 2 more victims that had previously been considered missing. One of the victims was 7-year-old Polish citizen Amelia. Poland's foreign ministry declared that she died with her mother during the attack. Now, General Alexander Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's armed forces, says that Ukraine's going to focus on strengthening the army through better mobilisation, recruitment and high-quality training. He was speaking this morning following a recent meeting with a number of senior military personnel. Writing on Facebook, he said, "The enemy continues its advance, so we have no choice but to strengthen our defence and reinforce our army to continue repelling Russia's full-scale aggression." It looks like they're going to be aiming to improve both the structure and conditions of military training. Among the key changes, we're told, the military is going to be extending the duration of its basic military training to 51 days. As an aside, I'm well out of date, but I did do a little time as a recruit trainer in my military service when our basic military training was 11 weeks or 77 days. So it gives you a bit of comparison. So Ukraine is going to increase its basic military training to 51, so about 4 weeks less than you get in a British or equivalent military. They're also going to introduce specialised instruction and an adaptation period within combat units. I presume by the adaptation period they mean actually then training on your specific role rather than just getting bunged in there and training on the job, which is never a good thing in the face of the enemy, although sometimes desperate measures and all that. Additional measures are going to include improving the selection of training of instructors. Always one of the most important parts of any training pipeline is get the instructors. Don't get a load of prima donnas who, the creeping excellence as we used to call it, I passed the course. If loads of people pass the course, that means it was easy. Therefore, I'm going to fail loads of people to show how hard it is. You don't want that. You want professional, good quality instructors who are good examples to the people they are training. They're also going to be modernising their training centre infrastructure and improving psychological and tactical adaptation support to newly mobilised personnel. Not entirely sure what that means. Anyway, to increase safety and ensure consistent training, General Syrsky said the military is going to be relocating programmes away from frontline areas where they can. Bearing in mind the ballistic missile threat means that everywhere is under some sort of threat. They're going to be assigning each army corps to certain training grounds in the centre and the west of the country. Syrsky said, "We have no right to be careless with the safety of our servicemen. I have issued the necessary orders to address the identified problems." Very good. You might say, why is it taking till now? I mean, in the white heat of the chaotic first few months, it was probably just a question of get everyone very basic training, give them a gun, give them a job, point them east. However, I think for the last couple of years, they would have had room to really look at the training pipeline. I'm a little surprised it's taken this long, but, I'm not there. Into Russia, and the SBU, Ukraine's security service, and the Ukrainian General Staff say that their forces destroyed 20 fuel tanks, 70% of the total, in the drone strike on Russia's Temryuk seaport in Krasnodar Krai last Friday. We reported it, but we didn't have these stats. This comes from Ukraine's General Staff. Then a source in the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine, speaking to our colleagues at the Kyiv Independent, says that they're targeted in that strike a liquefied natural gas terminal in Russia's Temryuk seaport, with drones triggering a massive fire that's been burning for the last 3 days. According to the source, the strike caused fires in more than 20 of the site's 30 storage tanks, an area covering 3,000 square metres. They also released a video to go with it, which is mostly orange because everything's on fire. Now, Russia says that it shot down 280 Ukrainian drones in the last 24 hours. There are unverified reports I've seen, but indicating something has hit places in occupied Crimea, and then in Ingushetia, that's a Russian region bordering Georgia. Krasnodar, as I just mentioned it, but that's to the east of the Kerch Bridge, and also Voronezh and Lipetsk. They are regions between Ukraine and Moscow. Russia also says it shot down a Ukrainian Su-27 fighter jet yesterday. I have seen that verified elsewhere. However, Tim White, a freelance journalist, that's always worth a follow. This morning he says that Russia also lost 2 pilots yesterday and probably more today, with the news of a Russian Army AN-22 transport aircraft, one of the big Antonovs, crashing in the Vodskoye Reservoir. That's in Ivanovo region of Russia, about 300 k's northeast of Moscow. 7 people were apparently on board. None have been found. Divers are searching in the reservoir for the bodies. Tim says it's the second AN-22 to crash in the same region in the last 18 months and was the last operational one of its type in Russia. He says there were reports that plane was decommissioned last year, but Russia's so short of cargo planes, it remained in service. Can't verify that, but interesting if that's a maintenance failure. Now then, a little further east from there, Russia says 14 people were injured, including a child, according to local authorities, in a Ukrainian drone attack on the city of Cheboksary. That's in the Chuvash region. There's imagery on social media purportedly showing a drone strike into an apartment block. Tim says that Ukraine's target may well have been the Cheboksary No. 2 thermal power plant or the VNIIR Progress Defence Factory, which we reported was hit a few weeks ago. That is only 500 metres away from where this blast occurred. And just finally for me, Francis, the Lithuanian government has declared a nationwide emergency situation today due to repeated cases of balloons flying into Lithuania from Belarus. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, I think, or maybe Monday. Now, the move's going to allow state institutions to coordinate responses more effectively and involve the military. Lithuania says that balloons have regularly been flown into their airspace, carrying contraband mostly, posing a risk to national security, human life, property and the environment. Lithuanian officials have accused Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko of deliberately allowing, and thereby weaponising, this practice of floating the balloons over, describing it as part of a wider hybrid attack on their country. Now, I think this is an interesting test case because on the one hand, you could say, it's only a balloon. Seems like an overreaction to use armed force to bring it down. But, it could easily escalate. And without getting all Tom Clancy about the whole thing, but these things, if they're carrying cigarettes now, they could be carrying weapons or explosives tomorrow. We've seen them shut down airspace already. Imagine a whole fleet of these things floated across Lithuania and elsewhere on the first day of some potential military provocation, shutting down airspace. We know Putin and, Lukashenko, but does what he's told. We know Putin likes to push until they meet resistance. And so why would he stop? Even if it is only a balloon with a few fags on board, why would he stop? So, interesting to see what Lithuania and NATO does next. That's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks, Dom, and to everyone who came to say hello at the Telegraph carol service at St Bride's, Fleet Street yesterday. One lady tried to argue that "O Come All Ye Faithful" is the best festive tune, followed closely behind by Wham's Last Christmas.
Wrong. Bruce Springsteen.
Bold choices. I'm a fan of the Sussex Carol, personally. But anyway, you rejoin us, everyone, as President Trump's peace plan is seemingly on the brink after President Zelensky insisted after that emergency summit in Downing Street yesterday, Ukraine had no obligation to cede territory to Russia. After that meeting, Zelensky, before hopping on a flight to Brussels, said, "We have no right under the law of Ukraine, under our constitution, or under international law, to be honest. And we have no moral right. That is what we are fighting for." Now, you may remember back in February, I was invited to that small roundtable with Zelensky, where, sensing this might be where we ended up, I asked him whether there was any scenario where he would agree to a ceasefire or to a peace deal that would see territory ceded to Moscow it does not currently control. He was unequivocal. That would not be a peace deal, he said. That would be a capitulation. Now, some would argue that still leaves him room for legal manoeuvre. That territory may not be handed over in a legal sense, but de facto. Yet that clearly wasn't the intent behind what he said back then. This is a long-standing red line. It's understood Kyiv is set to send Trump a Europe-backed counter-proposal later today, balancing out the previous draft and rejecting Russia's demand to give up the entire eastern Donbass. We don't know the full details of that proposal yet. Interestingly, though, Number 10 has voiced optimism a deal may be close. "This is the furthest we've got in 4 years," said the Prime Minister's spokesman, "and we welcome the fact that these talks are continuing at every level." However, it's worth bearing in mind that no government at the moment wants to be signalling negativity, in part not to risk the wrath of the Americans. At the same time as that meeting was happening in London, British Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper was in Washington meeting US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, trying to build bridges. It seems the most considerable progress yesterday was on the frozen Russian assets. London is now hopeful a deal could be done between European leaders within days. Yet whether it's all the assets or just some of them is unclear. And thanks to those listeners in Belgium, the chief blocker at the moment, we understand, who've written to us, giving us the mood music there. I'm going to reflect on some of that in a future episode. Now, if those frozen assets are unlocked, then the Trump administration isn't going to be happy, as they've clearly signalled they want all of the assets on the table for their negotiations with the Kremlin. It seems that tensions between the US and Europe are, frankly, spilling over, with Chancellor Merz's remarks yesterday that he was sceptical about American demands, and that sharing by Trump shortly after yesterday's talks of a New York Post article titled "Impotent Europeans Can Only Fume" as Trump sidelines them for Ukraine deal. Since then, in an interview with Politico published this morning, he denounced Europe as a decaying group of nations led by weak people, belittling the traditional US allies for failing to control migration and to end the war, and signalling he would endorse European political candidates aligned with his own vision for the continent. Something also stated very clearly in the new US national security strategy published last week, which we discussed. Further evidence of frustration in the White House can be found from reports that Trump's envoys pushed Zelensky for immediate consent to cede Ukrainian territory to Russia during their call on December the 6th, with their peace proposal worsening after their trip to Moscow, offering tougher terms on territorial concessions and control over the Zaporizhzhia power plant, while sidestepping, apparently, any real security guarantees pledges. Clearly, the envoys are under intense pressure now from Trump to get a deal done so that economic ties with Russia can resume, and have taken the decision to put pressure on Kyiv rather than Moscow. As Anne Applebaum writes in The Atlantic, quite a few Ukrainians, and indeed many Europeans, believe that the investigation which brought down Yermak has somehow been assisted by the Trump administration as a way of weakening Zelensky to force him to capitulate. She then goes on to underscore an irony here. Witkoff and Kushner are not taking kickbacks on government contracts, as some Ukrainian officials are now accused of doing. The corruption they represent is more profound. They're using the tools of the American state in a manner that happens to benefit their friends and business partners, even while they do terrible damage to America's allies, American alliances, and America's reputation. This is a conflict of interest on a grand scale, with no real precedent in modern American foreign policy. In Ukraine, the state itself is investigating the government, the cabinet, even the president's closest advisors. By contrast, it is impossible to imagine Kash Patel's FBI investigating anyone in Trump's White House. Any Russian who investigates Putin goes to jail. The word corruption has many nuances, and we aren't using enough of them when we talk about Ukraine. So an interesting piece there, which we'll link to in the show notes. And just as a side tangent on that point about America's reputation, CNN has a fascinating exclusive at the moment that I point you to on a previously undisclosed secret mission in 2017, so during Trump's first term, when the US extracted from Russia one of its highest level covert sources inside the Kremlin, partly because of concerns that Trump and his administration repeatedly mishandled classified intelligence that could contribute to exposing the covert source as a spy. But to wrap up, Dom, your Valentine, Czech President Petr Pavel is in the news again today.
Good man. Having
formally appointed the billionaire leader of the populist ANO party, Andrej Babis, as Prime Minister. His cabinet will include the anti-EU and pro-Russian SPD party and, your favourite, Dom, Motorists for Themselves. That party whose main agenda is opposing the EU's climate policy. It's got to be one of the best named parties in Europe, that surely. It's not yet clear what impact this will have on Czechia's support for Ukraine, but Pavel has been very vocal in saying that he intends to wield considerable influence on its foreign policy. So I think watch this space on that one. Meanwhile, Zelensky's in Rome, meeting Pope Leo XIV at Castel Gandolfo, the pontiff's hilltop vacation retreat, used by the popes since 1626. Sounds like the perfect place for a festive drink. He'll later meet Giorgia Meloni before sharing the revised peace plan with the US I mentioned earlier on. He'll also be trying to decide, I think, who will be the new head of his office after Yermak's resignation. We named the candidates yesterday, among them Denis Shmyhal, Ukraine's defence minister, digital transformation minister Mikhailo Fedorov, military intelligence chief Krilo Budanov, and deputy president's office head Pavlo Palisa. We understand the appointment was originally meant to be made last Thursday, but Zelensky held off. And since we mentioned the papacy, one last story. We learned last week that Pope Francis, who died back in April, of course, left money in his will to purchase ambulances for Ukraine. This was revealed by Sister Lucia Karam, who has been travelling to Ukraine on humanitarian missions since the start of the invasion, and said Francis had promised support, but didn't actually expect him to enshrine it in his will. Now, as we've talked about many times on the podcast, ambulances save hundreds of lives each month. So if you are looking for a cause to donate to this season, that might be worth your consideration. We featured on this podcast the NGO Ukraine Focus before, who I joined en route to Ukraine last year, stopping off at the D-Day anniversary to hear President Biden say Ukraine was fighting for the same values as those Americans who died to liberate Europe. I just mentioned that because it feels like a long time ago indeed. But let's turn now to Russia and our Russia correspondent on Ukraine, the latest, James Kilner. Now, James, at the moment, you're back in West Yorkshire, and I understand that you were in central Huddersfield overseeing, well, I hope you were anyway, the Huddersfield International Crisp Festival. And I was reading the article that you sent across about this. Absolutely fascinating stuff, but I think one perhaps for us to focus on instead in our final thoughts. James, to more important matters, these peace talks. Welcome back. What exactly is the Russian press saying about all this? Are they thinking that peace is imminent?
Francis, just to clarify, the International Crisp Championship happened in October. I was at the pub where the Crisp Championship was staged, the Sportsman's Arms in central Huddersfield, where they do excellent pints. But putting that aside, back to the issue of the day, the line in the Russian media continues to be consistent about where they are on these peace talks. They're still projecting the Europeans and the Ukrainians as the warmongers, and how the Kremlin and Putin are suing for peace with the US. The US, very much the good guys. There's been such a change from before the presidential election in the US last year, when Biden was the US president. The US were the bad boys, and now under Trump, they're very much the good boys, according to the Russian media. And it's the Europeans and the Ukrainians who are scuppering what should be a natural Russia-US peace deal. The Kremlin very much wants to do a deal with the US. It doesn't really want to do a deal with Ukraine. Various headlines saying that the contacts with the American side continue for existing channels. This is after the Witkoff-Kushner visit to the Kremlin. So the Kremlin's very much saying, we're still negotiating, we still want peace here. It's the Europeans and the Ukrainians who are messing this up. This is all sort of laced through, as it has been throughout, Francis, with increased posturing, increased sort of lacing the media with tales of heroism from Russian soldiers on the front line, daring do, etc., reminding Russian public of the soldiers and of their legacy. And today is the Defender of the Fatherland Day in Russia. And only today, Putin was handing out Hero Russia medals to military guys inside the Kremlin. So they are very much, as we've been reporting throughout, presenting the Kremlin as people, as the team that wants peace, but also pushing the front line. So there's a double-edged sword here about what they're trying to project.
Well, thanks very much, James. Now, that brings us on to the next, I think, big story of the week in the Russian sphere. And that, of course, is this new law, which will see 100,000 military reservists do 2 months of training. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, right. So this again feeds into what we've just been talking about, I feel. It's very much, we want to do a peace with the good guys, we want to do a peace in Ukraine, but also we're prepared to fight on. So this was a law Putin signed yesterday, where he called up 100,000 military reservists. If you remember, the Russia only set up its reserve army in 2015 after Crimea was annexed 12 months earlier. So it's called up 100,000 military reservists for 2 months training from the beginning of next year. Now, this doesn't automatically mean that after their 2 months training, they're going to get sent off to Ukraine. But it does come, as your listeners will probably know, a couple of months after reservists were mobilized into anti-drone units by various regions of Russia, and also after Parliament passed a law in mid-October, I think it was, which allowed reservists for the first time to be deployed alongside regular soldiers in Ukraine. So Putin and the Kremlin haven't said they're sending an extra 100,000 military reservists to Ukraine. That's not what has been said here. But it's moving in the direction. It feels like mobilization by stealth. It feels like this is part of the way the Kremlin is able to project pressure, to put pressure on Ukraine and its European allies at a time when it's trying to get the best peace deal possible with, increasingly, it seems, the help of the US. So I think this is another tool in the Kremlin's armory. We're going to have to be very watchful at the end of February, March time, and see what happens with these 100,000 reservists.
Interesting. Well, thanks very much, James. Now, of course, we've spoken with you many, many times about the economic picture in Russia at the moment and its various oscillations, but generally it's becoming more negative the longer the war is going on. And I know that you've been looking into VAT tax rises.
Yeah, the reason I've been looking at this, again, it's been spiking a bit on the Kremlin's propaganda outlets, this newspaper propaganda outlets. And this seems to be because it's triggering rare sort of anti-Kremlin sentiment. There was a protest in Irkutsk, town in Siberia, at the end of November, where 150 people gathered for this ostensibly pro-Putin, pro-Russia rally. This is really the only way of holding some sort of protest or public rally in Russia these days. They're banned. You have to get permission from local authorities. They're only likely to give permission if it's sort of a pro-Putin, pro-Russia rally. So the way around it is they apply for a nationalist, patriotic rally with the Russian flags and slogans in favour of Putin. And then they appeal. This is something which is fairly common in Russia. They appeal directly to the president as the embodiment of the state to do something about the situation which they're aggravated by. And in this case, it was this VAT tax rise, which is due to come in on January the 1st, which is raising VAT from 20% to 22%. And these apparently, according to reports, were local business leaders. They were complaining that this is going to really impact their business. It's going to cause a load of redundancies. It's going to cause a load of diminished business sales. It comes at a time, as we've increasingly been talking about, inflation's rising, the war debt's mounting up, jobs are diminishing, etc., etc. And now the start of this long Russian winter season, where you got utilities have seen their budget slash, street lighting, quality of roads, upkeep of municipal apartments, all this sort of stuff. So you get heating outages, power outages. So these are long winters in Russia. So people are getting increasingly annoyed. They know exactly why VAT is being increased. And the Kremlin is very specific about it when it announced the rise about 2 months ago. It said it's going to be increased to pay for the war in Ukraine. And these little tension points are really important to highlight. If you remember, I came on the podcast a couple of months ago or 6 weeks ago, I was talking about how there was a protest in Vladivostok where importers of cars there were getting very grumpy about an extra tax was being slapped on car imports. So this is the same sort of rare just sort of tension threshold. It's important to notice. Putin himself seems to have noticed. This is also important. He was at a big government strategy meeting yesterday, and in it, he talked about various different things. France's, one of his pet projects is trying to increase birth rate in Russia, and he's failing to do that, and he was grumpy about that. But he also spoke about the VAT rise, which is, to my knowledge, maybe the first time he's directly spoken about it. And he blamed it on the central bank. He said, well, this is a central bank idea to raise taxes. It's only going to be temporary. This was his line. I mean, of course, this is a Kremlin project, and of course, it's unlikely to be temporary, but this was his line. The point is here, ordinary Russians are frustrated. You can see this by this rare protest. This frustration is being reported back to Putin, who is then commenting on it live at a big Kremlin shindig, which is then reported on by all the Kremlin media. So interesting dynamics going on there, Francis.
Thanks, James. And I know that Dom's got a question as well in a bit, but just I have to ask, first of all, because it's relating to the news this week, of course, Putin being in India for this meeting with Modi and various different deals being signed. And we knew that we would be having you on this week. So very interested in your take on some of the major things that we've learned from this and perhaps signed even.
Well, I think it was a fairly scripted, optics-heavy visit by Putin. For Putin's propaganda machine, he really needed these photo shots of him laughing in the back of a car with Modi, having private dinners. He's great, inspection of the guard, this sort of thing. He needed all that, and he definitely got all that. And then there was there were allusions to deals around weapons, around joint production of passenger jet, this sort of thing. I think one of the most important policy outcomes of this trip, which really went underreported in the West anyway, was Putin needed Modi to agree to basically sending what could amount to be hundreds of thousands of Indian migrant workers to Russia to plug gaps in the workforce in Russia. This was trailed a week or 10 days before Putin's trip to Delhi, and then coverage of it really sort of dropped off. But we've now had a first deputy prime minister, Denis Manturov, has popped up and said that Russia will now be opening itself to, quote, an unlimited migration of workers from India. And the numbers are quite staggering. Like, he was talking about Russia needing 800,000 workers to plug gaps in its industry alone, and another 1.5 million to plug gaps in trade and logistics. Now, this is a critical deal for the Kremlin, really critical. I'd argue it's the most important thing that Putin came away with, although it's much more complicated for mainstream Western media to really get into. For India, it creates all sorts of optic problems here for them. Basically, India became the biggest buyer of Russian crude oil once the war in Ukraine had started. So it was in many ways propping up the Kremlin war machine that way. Now, it may be propping up the Kremlin war machine by literally sending labor to Russia. This is something that North Korea has been doing. The context with this here, we know that North Korea has sent tens of thousands, I think, 20,000 in one go and another 20,000 another go to work on farms and in light factory industries around St. Petersburg, as well as soldiers for the Russian army. But here we have the prospect of Indian workers really, really going to Russia and working in industry which will be helping the Russian war machine. So, for my mind, that is the most interesting, potentially spicy part of the Putin-Modi bilateral diplomatic talks.
Hi James, great to chat again, mate. On the India visit, I saw some comment that the lack of very public pronouncements about weapons deals and all the rest of it that you might expect at the end of a big bilat such as this spoke volumes, and the comment I saw was that must mean that even more had been done behind closed doors that we don't know about, and it was sort of styled as this is even worse for Ukraine. I mean, is that how these things happen? I've always expected, if they've done some great deals, that they take every opportunity to trumpet it. Or do you think it's significant that we didn't really see an awful lot in public at the end of the visit?
I did see some headlines, you're right. There wasn't like a great pronouncement at the end of the Modi-Putin talks. But there were some leaks about building joint production of a Russian passenger jet in India. There were some sort of slight tendrils about getting Russian missile supplies up and running again to India, etc. But no hard and firm stuff. I do think this stuff will leak out. I suspect it's very hard for India to be seen to be doing hard deals with Russia. And I think for the Kremlin, the photo was just as important as the hard deals. They're realistic about what they're going to get India to sign off on. I do think this labour migration deal, which has now been leaked out or is being worked on, but is definitely something Kremlin is very keen on, is probably the most important element of what Putin was doing down there. And that has been kept under wraps a bit. The prospect of Indian workers, like I've been saying, working in Russian industry, which is propping up a war in Ukraine, is very controversial. It's absolutely what I think the Kremlin would like to see happen. It's much harder to pull off. So they're pragmatic. They'll be deciding how to dress this up and seeing really where they can pull it off.
Yeah, and just to go back a stage from what you were saying earlier on, you were talking about the tension threshold, the communication between Putin and society over the economic impact of the war. How much wiggle room do you think he has to put the rise in VAT and other economic factors at the foot of the war? Because it's a special military operation, okay? It's just a small little, it's basically an exercise. It's not a war. So does he have the room to say, this is going to hit you in the pocket? Or will people turn around and say, well, hang on, I thought it was just some very minor military scrap? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I don't think the Russian public were ever really pulled into that ruse. I think that was for a Western or diplomatic audience. When I was there last October, I got a very strong sense that everyone knew exactly what was going on. They have to be very candid when they talk, but everyone I spoke to candidly said that they knew people who had been killed in Ukraine or come back badly injured, and how inflation was all linked to the war in Ukraine. Their neighbours had disappeared fighting the war in Ukraine. People know that this war is happening. The Russian sphere is so fluid that everyone has relatives or friends in Kiev and Moscow and St. Petersburg and Kazan and Kharkiv, etc. So people understand this. And I made the point earlier, when the VAT rise was announced at the budget a couple of months ago, the Kremlin specifically said this was needed to pay for the war in Ukraine. So, I mean, people know exactly what's going on in Russia. and their right to protest is severely restricted. Otherwise, I think you would see a lot more protests, but it is too dangerous to them. Well, it's outlawed, and it's basically too dangerous to break that ban. Like I said, the way around it is to apply for a patriotic rally with lots of Russian flags and pro-Putin posters, etc., and then appeal to the president personally to change an awkward situation, be it a rise in VAT or extra taxes on imported cars. But it's very, very important to track this sort of stuff, and especially important to track it when it appears to trigger a reaction from Putin, because he will be getting fed up information through his own channels that people are angry or irritated about VAT, and he's had to go on record, basically. This is the point I'm trying to make. Had to go on record and confront it directly to the Russian public. He's done what he always does. He's battered away, he's blamed someone else, and he said, hey, this is just a temporary problem. Don't overthink it.
Dom, where do you want to leave listeners first of all?
Thanks, Francis. A couple of thoughts, if I may. Well, two linked thoughts. I'll point folks to an interesting piece in the Financial Times by Gideon Rachman, the chief foreign affairs commentator. He was talking about the United States national security strategy that came out last Friday. We spoke about it, the days are blurring. I think it was yesterday. Could have been the day before. Anyway, Gideon makes the point. He says the national security strategy makes clear that there is now a battle underway between two different versions of the West, which pits the US and Europe against each other. The Trump administration view of Western civilization is based on race, Christianity and nationalism. The European version is a liberal view founded on democracy, human rights and the rule of law, including international law. In Europe, the biggest threats to the liberal version of Western civilization are the far-right parties that the US is promoting and the Russian state that the Trump administration is courting. Little wonder that the Kremlin senses an opportunity. Words there by Gideon Rachman. Interesting, that split. And I thought of that in the context of an email we got from Melis in Germany. Melis, thank you so much for getting in touch. He said, I am from East Germany and served in both the East German Army and the West German Army, the Bundeswehr. I'm still an active reservist in the Bundeswehr. I don't understand the pro-Russians in Germany who defend a system that did nothing good in East Germany during the 50-year occupation. Germany rightly paid massive reparations after World War II. We lost a great part of the territories in the East, and we paid substantial reparations, at least in East Germany. During the occupation, the Russians told us that the Germans could no longer be trusted after World War II because they hadn't fought against Hitler and the war themselves. Therefore, Germany had to remain occupied. The same standard the Russians applied to us back then should also apply to themselves. I've lived in both systems and I'm still grateful that the democratic system won, and I will defend it wherever and however I can. Europe has to get stronger, more independent, and has to stand together against Russia. No one else will help us. Thanks, Melis. As I said, thank you for that email from Germany. I just thought that was an interesting view of this idea about its hard power, soft power, its values, its nationalism, things that are going on at the moment. Russia's making hay, Putin's trying to drive the wedge. But I thought a lot came out of the national security strategy last Friday. Well worth a read if you've not done so. Lots of comment out there, ours included. But what it means, and is it a fundamental shift, a fundamental break in the West?
Well, thanks very much, Tom. It sounds like a lot also came out of the Huddersfield International Crisps Festival, because I've just been reading about it after James was signalling about it earlier on. Sounds fascinating. Apparently, all of the continents of the world were represented there. Spanish entries, Italian entries, Iranian entries, all coming from there. And the winner, Hammond Coleman's mustard flavour variety, based in Wales, beat 160 varieties of crisps and snacks to take the crown. So I think next year, James, you're going to have to be our representative there and give us a full report on what takes place, because I am a massive crisps fan, as long-standing listeners will know. Indeed, some actually sent some obscure flavours from around the world, and which were, well, some of them were deeply suspicious, that's all I'll say. But Dom, I think, is still traumatised from when on one of our train trips to Kyiv I was munching them in the middle of the night. But yes, so James, where would you like to leave listeners? I'm guessing it's not going to be with the Huddersfield International Crisp Festival, but, surprise us.
No, it's not, Francis. But as you know, I consider Huddersfield to be the centre of the known universe. So why wouldn't it have an International Crisp Festival? But I will leave listeners on an interesting note that I found this morning. This is the death of a Russian diplomat Actually, Russia's ambassador to North Korea, a guy called Alexander Mantsegura, 70 years old. He died beginning of this week. The actual cause of death hasn't been released, but the significance of his death does seem worth talking about very quickly. The context here is that the Russian approach to commissioning ambassadors differs slightly from the UK Western approach. They like to put someone in place for a long time, really embed them. That person becomes a real hinge for Russian foreign policy and relations with the host country, etc. The UK system seems much more carousel-like. But anyway, this guy, Matsugura, he'd been ambassador since 2014, but he'd spent his entire career as a diplomat in and out of North Korea, furthering Soviet or Russian relations. He spoke Korean fluently, apparently, and according to this very sort of unusually florid statement by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was absolutely instrumental in pushing North Korea-Russia relations up to this apparently stratospheric level they're at now. As your listeners will know only too well, North Korea has been a huge ally of Russia in the last few years, sent soldiers to fight alongside Russian soldiers, and it sent migrant workers to help the Russian economy. Now, this Russian statement, the Russian Foreign Ministry statement, said that Matsugura was one of the most outstanding, I'm quoting a direct quote here, one of the most outstanding representatives of the Russian diplomatic school, and made an invaluable contribution into boosting North Korea-Russia relations up to this very high level, and was the forefront of the most intensive work being carried out. It then goes on to say that he was an ideological inspirer, the driving force and the locomotive of the current very strong Russia and North Korea relations. And then it says this is a tremendous, irreparable loss. This, ladies and gentlemen and listeners of the podcast, is a remarkable statement by the Russian Foreign Ministry. I've never heard anything quite so emotive. I don't know whether this is going to impact North Korea-Russia relations in any way, but it does sound like the Russian Foreign Ministry and its embassy in North Korea has taken a hit with the death of this diplomat.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.